What is a scar but a wound that, though healed, can never be forgotten? A cut, scrape, or gash that never goes away. And which scars are the deepest? Those on the skin's surface, or hidden beneath, forever felt but never seen. By night, when one is alone with themselves, they surface and bleed freely once more. Monster's eyes snapped open at the sound of his own voice, growling softly. He sat up, fingers closing around the shaft of his halberd, looking this way and that. The children were gone. He was no longer a runt, but a giant of a mouse that could have given a rat a run for its money. His pale, hairless skin shifted and rippled with the motions of his powerful muscles as he lay back down on his side, clutching at his halberd and closing his eyes. He pulled his cloak back over his shoulder, a deep, emerald green cloak, the color of the eyes of a lost love. Monster shot a final uneasy look around. The group was hidden away inside a cardboard box in an alley. Tonight it was Peter's turn to sleep on the scale. Peter Dane, a brilliant former lab rat, who had dreamed up and built a terrestrial sailing vehicle, the Scale, from a great ape's roller skate. Matrix, the jumping spider, rested atop the mast. It was impossible to tell if he was awake or asleep, but at least he was looking away. Sweet, beautiful little Elizabeth Hartley lay curled up under her own little cloak, under the cover of the Scale. Stu the shrew snored loudly as he leaned against one of the Scale's wheels. Ben, another former lab specimen and the newest addition to the crew, was still and silent in a dark corner of their shelter, his snowy white fur sparkling in the faint light of a great ape's street lamp. Monster looked away. Everyone was asleep. Good. The huge mouse could finally give himself permission to cry. Yet even the slightest movement or sound was enough to shock him into stillness, for he knew that if Stu caught him in this state, the shrew would never let him live it down. So the moments ticked by, slow and painful. This time it had only been a dream, but there was a time that it had been quite real. Even now, Monster was occasionally haunted by memories of a time when he was not so large, not so strong, when his only recourse was to scramble home as quickly as possible and let his insane mother come screaming out of their dwelling to chase the other little boys away. Monster wiped away the tears with a corner of his cloak. He let out a long, shaking sigh and curled up to sleep. Yet his eyes remained wide open. Sleep was his only refuge, and yet it was sleep that had brought him the visions. Visions of the old days, sitting alone on the edge, watching the other children play, yet well aware he had no place among them. Visions of himself hiding under the twig pile by the village fire, bruised and bleeding. Visions of the old firekeeper, when he was not quite so old, coming to wash out a tiny mouse's scratches and bites and bandage him up. They were dead now, all of them. All except Monster, who had been living in a self-imposed exile at the time. It was poetic in a way, even if the firekeeper was once kind to him. The firekeeper had value to the village. No one bothered the firekeeper. The firekeeper didn't have to keep himself hard to protect against the others. The firekeeper could afford to take a chance on a friend or a loved one. The firekeeper was one of them. He belonged dead with all the rest. Monster's blood ran cold at the thought. The firekeeper had been kind to him, yes. Was this his gratitude for that kindness? Beads of cold sweat ran across Monster's skin as he glanced back to Elizabeth. She had also been one of them, and she had also been kind to him long ago. Would he really be so quick to see her suffer as well? Monster hastily gathered up his cloak and halberd and slipped out of their refuge. He needed air. More importantly, he needed to move, to outrun himself. The group's cardboard shelter had been one of many, left stacked in a narrow alley. The others were populated as well, mostly with rats, but also the occasional mouse. Most snored obliviously. A few raised a sleepy eyelid to note the strange mouse passing by, but quickly returned to their dreams. Distant engines of the great apes roared by at either end of the alley. Pigeons roosted on fire escapes that loomed overhead, often joined with rats. "Give it back!" Monster froze as he heard familiar voices. But this was no dream. He heard a small, youthful voice crying out, much as he once did long ago. "What's he got, eh? What is it?" "It's mine! Give it back!" "Now what's a boy like you want with a necklace, eh? You like nice things, do you? I bet we could get a bundle for it. We could live like kings for a day." "No!" "Ah, the kid's right. I'd rather eat for a lifetime." "Just give it back." "Quiet, Squite." Monster's brow furrowed in anger, and he raised his halberd in both hands, ready to attack. As he circled around the side of a box, he spotted a pair of mice cornering a tiny form. A child, by all appearances. A little mouse, dressed in a worn red sweater that looked a few sizes too large for him, fastened around the waist with a belt of crudely woven grass rope. Tears streamed from his eyes as the larger mice poked, prodded, slapped, and shoved him about, searching him for valuables. The halberd was too good for them, Monster concluded, as he dropped it to the ground with a clatter. The two larger mice froze. "Did you hear something, Mac?" "Yeah, I heard something." Both mice wailed as their feet left the ground. Monster let out a growl as he lifted them by the collars of their jackets. "What's going on here?" "Ain't nothing going on, Jumbo. Yeah, nothing. We was just having a bit of fun, that's all. Yeah, bit of fun." Monster glanced down to the little mouse, who huddled in a corner, arms wrapped around his knees as he sobbed. "Is this your idea of entertainment?" "Well, fun is subjective, you know." "Yeah, subjective." Monster raised an eyebrow as he eyed the little mouse. "What's going on?" The little mouse didn't immediately answer. Instead, he wiped his eyes off on his sleeve and rubbed his knuckles across his nose. Monster heaved a sigh and glared back and forth at his captives. "Leave us, and don't let me catch you robbing anyone again." Both mice nodded eagerly. Sure. We'll be good. Promise." Monster set them down and sent them scurrying with a snarl. Then he crept to the back of the box and sat down alongside the little mouse. Taking the cloak from around his shoulders, he offered a corner to the boy. "They're gone. No one will trouble you again tonight." The little mouse blew his nose into the edge of the cloak and gasped for breath. It made no difference to Monster. The cloak had seen worse in the time he wore it. The two sat in silence for a while, alone with the sounds of a faint breeze and the roaring of great ape engines in the distance. The little mouse appeared to calm down, now just staring at the ground. Monster grumbled at last and rose to his feet. "I must be going. Be on your guard, boy." Yet as Monster slung his cloak about his shoulders, the little mouse looked up at him with tears in his eyes and finally spoke. "They took my mother's locket." Monster grunted. "They didn't take your mother, did they?" The little mouse shook his head. "Then I suggest you get back to her." Monster seized up his halberd, striking the blunt end against the ground. "These streets are no place for a child." The little mouse burst into tears again, burying his face in his hands. Monster raised an eyebrow. "And what's the matter now? Is there a reason you wouldn't want to get back to her?" The little mouse shook his head. "I don't know where she is." Monster sighed. "I see." He thought back to his own mother. For a long time after her death, he kept a shred of her shawl, if only for the lingering scent of her that it carried. A steely gleam entered the huge mouse's eye, and he bent towards the ground, sniffing about, until he caught the familiar scent of the two thugs. The little mouse wiped the tears from his eyes as he watched, the faintest spark of curiosity flickering to life in his eyes. "What are you doing?" "Retrieving what was taken," Monster muttered in response. "Wait here. I'll be back soon." Far from doing what he was told, the little mouse instead crawled to his feet and quietly crept after Monster as the huge mouse stalked away down the alley. Monster had been in a foul mood, and the thought of raining down fiery vengeance upon two bullies appealed to him. He followed their scents with a single-minded passion, the entire world melting away around him. Monster didn't notice the small shape trailing after him. It wasn't too long before Monster caught wind of two very familiar voices in a cardboard box up ahead, and one that was not so familiar.
"Cheap brass, I'll give you 5.
5, he says. We had to deal with an angry behemoth to get this much. It's worth at least 50.
And it was more trouble than it was worth. I feel bad for you boys, but I don't pay extra for sentiment."
Monster growled in anger. Then his anger turned to mirth, and his mouth pulled into a cruel grin as he peered inside. Inside was a little shop, consisting of several tables laden with glittering goods. No doubt stolen, of course. 3 mice stood in the back, the 2 muggers joined by a rotund fellow in a pinstriped jacket. Monster drew back outside, laid his halberd on the ground, and dug his fingers under the box. With a great heave of his muscles and a savage growl, he tipped the box upwards, sending its contents and occupants sliding to one end with surprised cries. There were many sounds of crashing and smashing as the box settled onto a new side. Curious sets of eyes peered out of boxes, trash cans, and dumpsters all throughout the alley, up from storm drains and down from fire escapes. This included a certain small group in another box not far away, who were shaken from a sound sleep by the commotion. Peter was the first to poke his head out and look around.
"Hello? What's this?"
He was just in time to spot Monster's tail disappearing into another box. The huge mouse cracked his knuckles as he glowered down at the tangled jumble of mice.
"It's him again,"
one of the thugs cried, pointing up at Monster. A second later he was hauled off the ground by his throat and nearly passed out as a putrid rush of wind came snarling from between Monster's bared teeth.
"You have something that doesn't belong to you."
"No, I don't, no, I don't,"
the terrified mugger exclaimed. Pointing to his partner, he added,
"He does."
The other mouse's mouth flapped madly in silent protest, eventually giving way to a terrified wail as he joined his partner.
"Well?"
Monster barked.
"Fence!"
the second mouse cried out, pointing to the mouse in the pinstriped jacket. Monster grunted with a scowl and bashed his captives together like a pair of living cymbals. He left them dazed, holding their aching sides on the ground, and advanced on the third mouse. The fence blubbered incoherently for a moment, and then turned to flee. Monster was on him in a moment, pouncing like a feline on the hunt, and forcing the fence neck first to the ground.
"Take it all!"
the fence exclaimed.
"It's yours! I'll go straight, I swear!" "Lock it!"
Monster growled.
"Now!" "Sure, fine! I got dozens! Take your pick!"
Monster flipped the fence on his back, and leaning close, inhaled. It was not a pleasant smell. The fence stank of garbage and rot, but Monster detected the faintest scent of something else, a sickly sweet, perfumey sensation.
"Your breast pocket. Empty it out!"
The fence nodded emphatically, fingers digging in and scattering coins, used tissues, a few empty nutshells, and at last a glittering chain from which hung a small round pendant, its halves connected with a little hinge on one side, and snapped closed by a pair of overlapping knobs on the other. Monster seized it up without hesitation and popped the locket open. Within, one side held a photograph of 2 mice, one man, one woman. The other side held a picture of 3 young boys, the youngest of which Monster recognized in an instant. Snapping the locket shut, Monster turned his fiery glare back to the fence.
"This is the part where you run away and never come back."
The fence nodded.
"Deal!"
Monster released the mouse's shoulder and took a step back to watch as his victim scampered away into shadows unknown. Whether he truly did never return to that alley or even the surrounding block, Monster would never know. But he really didn't care either. As Monster turned around to begin the short walk back to the young mouse's hiding place, however, he discovered that to be unnecessary. Monster's brow furrowed as he spotted that same boy, just a few short paces away, staring wide-eyed at the scene.
I told you to wait.
The young mouse gulped.
Sorry, mister. I was afraid.
Monster grunted.
Do you feel better now?
The little mouse shook his head.
That's why I told you to wait.
With that, Monster held out the locket.
I believe this belongs to you.
The little mouse stared at the locket as it dangled from Monster's fingers, but he made no move to take it. Monster waited only a moment. He then tossed the locket to the little mouse and stalked past, paying little attention to whether the child caught it or not. The little mouse bent down, picking up his mother's locket, and draping it around his neck, tucked it under his sweater. He watched Monster's retreating form for a time, glanced to the box where the fence once made his shop, and back to Monster again. Deciding it was best to have a friend, even a scary friend like Monster, the young mouse started after the bald giant, without a further thought to his own safety. Peter flashed an amused smile as he watched the two returning to the shelter. Matrix, riding on Peter's shoulder, silently applauded. In Peter's towering shadow, the smaller forms of Elizabeth, Stu, and Ben poked their heads out.
What'd we miss?
The shrew asked. If I had to hazard a guess, Peter mused, I would say Monster had another bad dream.
Again?
Stu exclaimed.
That's the third time this week. What's eating him?
It looks like Monster made a friend,
Elizabeth observed, her gaze immediately settling on the tiny mouse following in his trail. She folded her hands over her heart as a warm, fuzzy sensation swept over her.
Oh, isn't he just precious?
Stu glanced from Elizabeth to the young mouse and back, raising an eyebrow.
Yeah, he ain't.
I wonder where his mother is, Ben mumbled. The former lab mouse often thought of such things, having never had a family of his own. Until, of course, he met Elizabeth and asked her to be his mother. "Hello!" Peter called out, waving as Monster approached. "Another grand night out, righting wrongs and all that?" Monster's only answer was a low grunt as he slunk past Peter. Peter chuckled as he turned back to Monster's little companion. "And who might you be, young fellow?" The young mouse didn't answer, but took a step back as he gazed up, his lip quivering as he stared aghast at the rat. "I say, is something the matter?" Elizabeth, the more perceptive of the two, tapped Peter on the side.
You're a rat, Peter.
Why, yes, quite.
And do you remember what the rats are like in this neighborhood?
Peter paused a moment, and then his eyes widened and he nodded as it dawned on him. "Oh, indeed!" Elizabeth looked back to the terrified child and gave him her warmest smile, which, as Stu could attest, was quite a sight to see.
You look hungry.
The little mouse nodded. Elizabeth glanced up at Peter, a knowing look in her eyes.
He's hungry. Could you get him some dinner?
Peter raised an eyebrow for a moment, and then nodded as he caught on to Elizabeth's train of thought. "Yes, of course. Well, then, I suppose I'm off, aren't I?" Elizabeth nodded.
I suppose you are.
Peter tipped his cap to the little mouse, and then to Elizabeth. "Well then, cheerio!"
I prefer cornflakes,
Stu quipped, drawing a soft chuckle from Ben. Elizabeth waited a moment for Peter to vanish into the landscape of waste and dumpsters, and then she held out her hand, inviting the little mouse in.
It's all right. You'll be perfectly safe here.
The little mouse looked past Elizabeth to where Monster sat, leaning on his halberd, cloak wrapped tightly around him for warmth. The boy crept in very quietly, past Elizabeth, past Stu and Ben, and settled down about an arm's length from Monster.
I'm Stephen,
he whispered to the huge mouse. Monster gave him a brief, wavering look and nodded slightly.
Monster. Jeremiah. Jerry. But everyone calls me Monster.
Elizabeth shot a curious glance to Stu. The shrew answered her with an identical expression.
He never calls himself Jerry.
Elizabeth crossed her arms as she turned back to Monster and Stephen, raising an eyebrow, the corners of her mouth tugging into a bemused half-smile. She looked immensely pleased.
So, Stephen, where did you come from?
Stephen looked up to Monster as if for approval. The huge mouse nodded back down to him. Looking back to Elizabeth, he answered, "Far away."
Far away where?
Stephen shrugged. "I don't know, just far away." Elizabeth smirked as she addressed Monster.
He sounds like you.
The little mouse perked up at that. "I do?" He looked up at Monster with a bright, wide grin. The large mouse grunted and shook his head.
Let's put it this way,
Elizabeth added.
Where are your parents? They must be worried about you.
Stephen's expression immediately fell, and tears began to well in his eyes as he inched closer to Monster. The large mouse set a comforting hand on the small one's shoulder. "He told me he doesn't know."
I see.
Elizabeth bit her lip in thought.
Can you tell us what happened?
Stephen was silent. He just looked at the ground, wrapped his arms about himself, and curled up. Elizabeth looked to Monster and shrugged helplessly. The large mouse squeezed Stephen's shoulder and whispered, "Tell us what happened, and we may be able to help." Stephen gulped for air and answered in a faint squeak,
We were going to paradise. Everyone said it would be safe, that nothing could hurt us there. We were almost there when...
Stephen fell silent.
When what?
Elizabeth prompted. Stephen shrugged but refused to say another word. "When something happened," Monster guessed, "and you lost them." Stephen nodded. Monster grunted. He gave Stephen's shoulder a final squeeze and withdrew his hand. "Rest easy, boy. We'll talk again later." Elizabeth nodded, taking a seat on Stephen's other side, and draped her cloak across his shoulders.
You're going to be all right, I promise.
Stu, meanwhile, wore a broad, mirthful grin, which he turned upwards towards Monster. The huge mouse gave him an irritated growl. "What is it?" Stu chuckled. "Y'all just a big softy, ain't you?" Monster's brow furrowed, and he bared his teeth. But as he remembered the frightened little mouse at his side, he stopped, just short of roaring some threat back. Stu only laughed harder. So the little group settled into an uneasy silence. Stu plopped down beside Elizabeth, and then shot Ben a dirty look as the former lab mouse squeezed in between them. By the time Peter returned, Stephen had nodded off. The rat set down his bundle at Monster's feet, and settled in beside the large mouse for the night. Somewhere in the stillness, there was a loud growl, which shook Stephen awake.
It's nothing,
Elizabeth assured him, patting her stomach.
I just smelled your dinner is all.
Monster opened one eye and handed the bundle to Stephen. "If you're awake, you can eat." As the little mouse nibbled at his meal, Matrix tapped Peter on the shoulder, gently rousing the rat from his rest. As Peter opened his eyes, he gave a weak smile. "Feeling better, lad?" Stephen gave Peter a nervous glance, but as he ate another crumb, he appeared to calm down. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "I'm glad to hear it." There came a pair of loud snores beside Elizabeth. Ben and Stu leaned against each other for support, quite oblivious to the activity nearby. The others ignored them.
Do you think you're ready to talk now?
Elizabeth asked. Stephen paused, mid-bite.
"Let him finish eating,"
Monster interjected, earning a look of immense gratitude from the little mouse. As Stephen ate his last bite, Peter whispered something to Matrix. The spider immediately crawled down the rat's arm, hopped to the ground, and scuttled up to Stephen. The young mouse flinched at Matrix's approach. "Don't be afraid," Peter spoke up. "He's quite friendly, I assure you." Matrix reached out a forelimb, brushing the tip of Stephen's nose. The young mouse twitched and giggled. "That tickles." Another limb brushed along the bottom of Stephen's foot, prompting him to twitch and shake with laughter. Limb after fuzzy limb poked and prodded Stephen, tugging at his sweater and brushing against his skin. The little mouse howled with mirth, curling to protect himself as best he could, while Matrix giggled along with him. Eventually, Matrix left the laughing child alone and returned to Peter's shoulder, where he proceeded to chitter softly into the rat's ear. Peter listened with keen interest all the while. When at last the spider finished, Peter motioned to Elizabeth.
"Pardon me, Bess. Can I have a word?"
Elizabeth nodded, rising to her feet and accompanying Peter into the alley outside. Once there, Peter's expression turned suddenly grim.
What's the matter?
Elizabeth asked. Peter glanced back to the cardboard box.
"This child has been branded."
Elizabeth blinked.
Branded? As in, is he a lab specimen?
"If only," Peter muttered.
"I mean branded as in livestock. Someone has been putting him to work. According to Matrix, the boy is quite muscular, suggesting rather intensive labor, likely for quite some time."
Peter paused for a moment.
"Now it's your turn. What have you learned?"
Elizabeth shrugged.
Not much. He said his family was going someplace called Paradise, where they would be safe, and then something happened. He wouldn't say what.
Peter scratched his chin in thought.
"I see. Well, I would suggest we give him the night to sleep, and talk again in the morning. Perhaps then he'll be calm enough to answer some more questions."
Elizabeth nodded her agreement, and the two returned to their shelter. Monster and Stephen had already dozed off, and Stu and Ben had yet to awaken. Peter curled up on the scale, and Elizabeth stretched out near the others. But as peaceful as the scene may have appeared, there were two mice who did not rest so easy. Monster was tormented by a return to his turbulent dreams, and Stephen shuddered in his dreams as his loving family was taken away over and over, and he was left alone with a savage band of street rats. As the sun rose, both of them struggled to shake the sleep from their heads.
"Rise and shine, lads,"
Peter announced as he sat up and stretched. Noting Monster and Stephen's condition, he added,
"Well, at least rise, at any rate."
"Just 5 more minutes, Ma,"
Stu murmured. 10 minutes, Ben added.
"Yeah, 10,
Stu agreed.
10 is good."
What's for breakfast?
Elizabeth asked. Peter stuck his head outside and took a deep breath.
"Italian, if we hurry. But be quick. It looks like there's a fair crowd gathered."
The neighboring dumpster was teeming with early risers. Mice, rats, and a swarm of flies. A little rope ladder led up the side, having been built and placed some time ago when Peter was still a resident of the neighborhood. It was now public property, and Peter's role in its creation was quite forgotten. Up one side climbed Elizabeth and her companions, and then back down the other in pursuit of the feast of discarded food below. Matrix, meanwhile, took up a perch at the top of the dumpster, where he donned a little cowboy hat, twirled a silk rope, and attempted to lasso a fly or two.
"Pasta again?"
Stu complained.
"Why can't we ever get something good, like meatballs? Or a slug? I'd take a slug over this cheap imitation any day."
"Can I have yours, then?" Ben asked. Stu gave him a dirty look.
"What, y'all want me to starve?"
Control.
Elizabeth whispered to herself over and over in a desperate mantra, while her stomach roared.
Self-control. Self-control.
Monster led the way, the crowd parting for him with many an uneasy glance, like the Red Sea parting before Moses. Stephen followed close at Monster's heels, his eyes flicking this way and that as he recognized every other mouse and rat he passed. He remembered them as faces to be given a wide berth. Fortunately, they were more concerned with the large mouse passing by than the little mouse that clung to him for safety.
"Good morning, lads," Peter greeted each rat and mouse in turn as he passed. "Good morning."
Most ignored him. A few answered with an extremely rude phrase, others with notable Italian hand gestures. Ever since Elizabeth was involved in an unfortunate incident involving the street rats' food supply, Peter had been less than welcome among them. With the death of their leader, and Peter's role in restoring order, however, he was now somewhat tolerated. Monster scared open a clearing in one corner with a snarl, sending rats and mice alike scurrying, and drawing a pronounced cringe from Elizabeth.
"Do you have to be like that?"
she asked. Monster raised a curious eyebrow.
Like what?
Elizabeth paused a moment, considering her next words. Then she threw caution to the wind and simply spoke her mind.
You're a bit of a bully, aren't you?
No, Monster retorted. A bully would have chased them, beaten them, and stuffed them in a pop can, which may or may not have been empty. Amen, Stu agreed. Enough kibitzing. Let's eat.
Ben said nothing, nor did he have to. The way he slurped up a noodle was answer enough. So they settled in to eat. Monster chopped out a squarish section of spaghetti for himself and Stephen. Disgruntled Stu nibbled a bit at the edge, having grown weary of city fare after spending several days camping out in the alley. He much preferred the bounties of the wild. Ben dove in, like a child leaping into a pile of leaves, for the discarded food of great apes held flavor the like of which he had scarcely dreamed of during his days in the lab. Elizabeth took a zen-like approach, greedily sucking up one noodle and then sitting back to regain control of herself before moving on to another. Peter was the most at ease, having lived this way for much of his adult life. He sipped at a cup of morning tea while munching absently at a crust of garlic bread and looking over a discarded newspaper. He noted that Stephen appeared to be in a far better state of mind, laughing at Ben's antics and Monster and Stu's relentless bickering. Yet the pleasantries came to an abrupt end when Stephen was heard to remark to Monster, "Someday I want to be just like you." It was as if someone had flipped a switch in the back of the huge mouse's head. His brow furrowed as he glanced down at Stephen, and he shook his head.
No, you don't.
Stephen went silent under Monster's glare. Why not?"
Because even I don't want to be like me,
Monster answered. "Why?"
I am not a pleasant man to be around.
I'll vouch for that,
Stu agreed.
Why?
Because he's angry all the time is why,
Stu interjected. Monster shot the shrew a dirty look, but nodded.
There is much I would prefer to forget.
Why?
Monster began to give a warning growl, much as he might when talking to Stu, but caught himself, and swallowed it before giving it voice.
Can't you say anything but why?
Stephen paused a moment, and then in a very scholarly, intellectual tone he asked, "What is your rationale for this position?"
Ha!
Stu laughed.
I like this kid.
Monster glared at Stu, and rising to his feet, he stalked back to the rope ladder and climbed out of the dumpster. Stephen stared after Monster for a time. Then he began to take notice of his surroundings. While Elizabeth and her friends may have been friendly enough, there were many folk around who were far less savory. Stephen began to feel exposed and vulnerable. Swallowing hard, he darted away to follow Monster.
Wait!
Elizabeth called out. Stephen paid her no heed. Monster meant safety, and the fearful little mouse was eager to get back to the refuge of the giant mouse's side. Elizabeth glanced back to Peter.
I'm going after him.
Peter nodded. "We'll meet you back at the scale." Outside, in the alley, Stephen slid down the ladder, hitting the ground with a light tap. His voice was considerably louder. "Monster!" He glanced about in a wide-eyed panic. "Monster!" With so many rats and mice in the dumpster, the suddenly empty alley was left shrouded in an eerie silence. Stephen's heart pounded as the emptiness burrowed its way into the core of his being. Tears of terror welled in his eyes as he looked this way and that. "Monster!" Stephen chose a random direction and ran for his life. "Monster!" As Stephen passed a narrow space between two boxes, a cold steel crescent hooked itself under his collar and raised him off the ground. A hook-handed rat chomping on a cigar blew a smoke ring into Stephen's face as he surveyed his catch. He wore a sleeveless black jacket, a skull and crossbones stamped on the back, and a bowler pulled low over his brow.
Well, well, lucky Stevie, my lad. You've led me on a merry bleeding chase.
William Dawson, a British wharf rat, had come to America as a stowaway in the engine room of a cargo ship, earning him the nickname Bill from the Bilge, or just Bilge for short. Stephen knew the rat's voice all too well.
"Monster!" he cried out in a desperate plea.
Oi, I've been called plenty of things, boyo, but I'm no monster.
Bill chuckled at his remark.
Stephen!
Bill fell silent as he recognized the voice of Elizabeth Hartley. It was a voice he knew well, having crossed paths with her twice before. He immediately broke out in a broad grin. Stephen, on the other hand, had collapsed into a quaking mass of despairing sobs.
That's right, boyo. You give yourself a good cry, nice and loud, so little Miss Friendly can find you.
Bill waited as Elizabeth's light steps grew nearer. Then, quick as a flash, he lunged around the corner, hand darting for what he thought was her shoulder. Instead, a large hand, almost the size of Bill's, caught him by the wrist, and a hairless, snarling muzzle forced itself into his face.
My missy, what a big bleeding axe you have!
Monster was not amused.
Put the boy down, or I'll take your other hand, too.
Monster brandished his halberd in silent warning. It was a weapon Bill remembered well. Nearly a year ago it had lopped off his left hand, which he had since replaced with the hook that now held Stephen aloft. It wasn't an experience he cared to repeat, but the rat had given as good as he took, and he wasn't about to back down. He wrenched his wrist free and retreated between two boxes.
Here now, much as I'd like another go at you, there's a little fella to think of, eh? Don't want him getting cut in the scuffle, do we?
Bill held Stephen forward like a living shield. Monster dropped his halberd in answer and advanced down the narrow opening.
Let him go, Dawson. Now, why would I go and do that, eh? Especially after giving the brat food, clothes, a roof over his head. He owes us.
Monster noticed a flash of red atop one of the boxes and spotted Elizabeth looking down. She nodded to him and motioned for Monster to force Bill further back. Glancing back to Bill, Monster bared his teeth.
Let the boy go, and let's settle this like men.
Bill took a step back to match Monster's advance.
Love to, chum. After I've taken the waif back to the workhouse, I don't care to go chasing him all over town again.
Then Elizabeth made her move, diving for Bill and catching him around the throat with one arm. The rat gagged for breath, staggering backwards as Elizabeth landed against his back. His arms flailed as he fought for his balance, and in the rush of panicked motions, Stephen slipped from Bill's hook and tumbled to the ground. Monster darted past Stephen, lunging for Bill's face. Elizabeth leapt from the rat's shoulders, just as Monster crashed into him, teeth snapping at Bill's nose and his fists pummeling the rat's face and throat. Bill hit the ground with a crash, Monster tumbling past him and rolling to his feet just behind the rat. Elizabeth darted past Bill's fallen form, pulled Stephen to his feet, and hastily ushered the little mouse out into the alley. The rat, however, regained his feet before Monster could follow. He shook his head and blinked the stars from his vision. As he realized Stephen had escaped, an unpleasant sneer crossed Bill's face.
Well now,
he mused, turning his glare back to Monster,
I suppose I'll take that rematch now.
As he spoke, Bill uncoiled a very familiar chain from around his shoulders, slipping his hook through a link at one end, while his hand curled around the chain a bit further along.
I have been itching for some payback.
With that, Bill lashed out with a swipe of his chain, just narrowly missing Monster as the huge mouse darted around the corner of a box.
Oi, come back here, you bloody coward!
Bill drew back the chain and made for the end of the passage.
Ha! There you are!
Monster lay in wait, in an adjacent passage between the back of the box and the brickwork of a titanic building. He crept backwards as the rat crossed into his sight, waiting for the next lash of Bill's chain. Monster didn't have to wait long. Bill whipped the chain forward, swinging in an overhead arc. Monster squeezed aside, the silver links just grazing his sides. Before Bill could draw the chain back again, Monster set his foot on it, holding the chain in place while he wound it around his hand. With a roar, Monster rushed forward, the the chain looping behind him, and leapt against the brick wall. Launching himself off the side of the building, Monster rammed his shoulder into Bill's chest, sending the rat staggering backwards, arms flailing as he fought to regain his balance. Monster pressed his advantage, dashing up Bill's stomach, leaping over his shoulders, and trapping the rat's throat in a silver loop of chain. Bill hit the ground with a crash, gagging as Monster pulled the chain tight about his neck. In his panic to loosen the metal noose, Bill didn't notice it going slack. Monster knew better than to leave him conscious. No sooner had Bill freed himself than he saw Monster leaping down at him from the sky, a hairless fist leading the way. There was a loud crack as Monster drove the rat's head into the cement. It had not been a fatal blow, nor was it meant to be. It was, however, enough to leave William Dawson dazed. Monster growled, rubbing his sore arm as he eyed his fallen adversary. Without another thought, he turned away and emerged back into the alley where Elizabeth and Stephen waited. Monster snatched up his halberd and looked down at Elizabeth.
We should be going.
What about? Stephen began to ask. Monster cut him off.
He doesn't matter.
The others will meet us back at the scale.
Elizabeth spoke up. Monster grunted.
Then we should go there.
Then he was simply off, quite abruptly. Stephen looked at the ground and heaved a sigh. He doesn't like me, does he? Elizabeth rubbed the little mouse's shoulder.
I actually think he does. Monster is just a little monster.
You really think so? Elizabeth nodded.
I do. Now come along.
Elizabeth took Stephen's hand and led him in the scale's direction. Their nails clicked against the hard ground as they crept along, pausing every so often to listen when some distant sound floated their way. Even in the city there were predators. Especially in the city, in fact. Elizabeth considered for a time how to broach the matter raised during the previous night.
Stephen, can I ask you a personal question?
The little mouse regarded her warily. After a time, he nodded.
What did happen to you?
Stephen didn't answer.
Let's put it this way,
Elizabeth added.
Can you show us where it happened?
Stephen stopped in his tracks. For a moment, Elizabeth thought he might bolt. Instead, however, the little mouse just plopped down onto the ground and hung his head. Elizabeth knelt beside Stephen and stroked his hair.
All right, then. Can you tell me where it was? I'll go there and work it out for myself.
That appeared to upset Stephen even more. He looked up at Elizabeth, his face as white as a sheet, and shook his head emphatically. No, you can't go there. You can't. There's cats everywhere. Now it was Elizabeth's turn. The mention of cats alone was enough to drain the color from her face, as she was taken back to a terrible night long ago, when she too had heard the cry of the cat. The yowls rang in her ears, and she could almost see a single green eye, streaked with red, gazing back at her. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Elizabeth squeezed Stephen's shoulder and nodded.
All right, then. But please make me a promise. You'll tell Monster everything. Because we do want to help you find your family. But we need to know where to start looking. Deal?
Stephen gulped, the look of horror lingering on his face for a long time. At last he nodded. Just don't go there. Elizabeth forced a smile.
Deal.
They found Monster in the back of their box, crouching behind the scale, with his halberd leaning against his shoulder. The skin around his eyes glistened faintly in the shadows, but at the first sound of Elizabeth and Stephen's approach, he wiped them off on the side of his arm. Elizabeth nudged Stephen in the back.
Go on.
The little mouse crept to the bald giant's side. Monster? The huge mouse peered down at Stephen, a suspicious glint in his half-opened eyes, and grunted. Stephen took a deep breath. There's something I have to tell you. As Stephen launched into his story, 4 sets of curious eyes arrived in time to catch wind of it. Peter very quietly crept into the shelter, followed by Ben and Stu,
while Matrix rode on his shoulder. All of them remained quiet as Stephen's quivering voice related the events leading up to this point.
Dad always said paradise was just a story,
Stephen began.
but when a cat killed Alec, he started talking about it all the time.
Alec? Peter asked.
My oldest brother,
Stephen explained. He drew the locket from inside his sweater and popped it open for all to see.
He was Dad's favorite.
Stephen's voice trailed off for a moment as he stared down at the pictures of his family. He looked up as he felt a large hand rest on his shoulder. Monster nodded down at Stephen, prompting him to go on.
Then he started talking to our neighbors. One day we all packed up and left.
For paradise,
Monster guessed. Stephen nodded.
They said it was under a tree so the cats couldn't find us.
Wouldn't you have had to emerge for food?
Monster asked. Stephen nodded.
But Dad said there were tunnels everywhere, so it was safer than back home.
Monster's brow furrowed, a cynical spark flashing to life in his eye. Yet he fell silent, listening intently as Stephen continued.
We were almost there when the cats found us. There was a big black, mean one with one eye.
Elizabeth felt her stomach twist into knots at the mention of a cat with one eye. She couldn't be sure, but if her memory was correct, the one she had seen at Edge of the Gorge had one eye as well, and judging by the way it blended into the dark, it may have been black as well. Stephen wasn't looking at all well himself. There was a dazed look in his eyes, and he swayed uneasily on his feet.
I hid. I didn't see anything else, but I heard it. I tried to cover my ears, but I heard it.
Stephen closed the locket and tucked it back into his sweater. He sat down, sniffling, and wrapped his arms around himself like an impromptu straitjacket.
I'm sorry to pry any further, Peter spoke up, but can you tell me where this happened?
Stephen gazed up at Peter with a look of horror. After a moment he gulped and nodded. Rising shakily to his feet, he staggered out of the shelter and led Peter to the end of the alley. Monster and Elizabeth trailed behind, exchanging curious glances. There, Stephen pointed down the sidewalk to a wire fence some distance away between two buildings.
Elizabeth, Peter muttered, take the lad back to our box, will you? I'm going to have a look about the scene of the crime.
Elizabeth nodded, taking Stephen by the shoulders and gently ushering him away.
You've been very brave, dear. Now come along.
But as they were leaving, Stephen saw Monster following Peter to the other side of the alley and beyond.
No, he shouted. Monster, don't go!
Like a greased octopus, he slipped from Elizabeth's grasp and darted away through the jungle of refuse.
Stephen, wait!
Elizabeth exclaimed, but it was too late.